Hello, my name is David Depler. I'd like to take you through a presentation on using technology and science to better understand the breath and breath work. At the end of this presentation, I'd like you to walk away with three things. Number one, understanding how breath regulates the acid-base balance of blood and what that means for us. Number two, appreciate the relevance of heart rate variability to breath and specifically to understanding optimal breath rates. And then lastly, I'd like you to have a glimpse into effective breath work, recognizing that more of this work will come during the lab session. So to start, let's take a moment to appreciate just how cool the diaphragm is. As you realize already, the diaphragm has a key role in respiration and breathing. The diaphragm also enhances postural control. As it turns out, a properly functioning diaphragm is crucial for trunk stabilization. Without proper movement, our pelvic floor, our deep neck flexors, and our vocal folds actually struggle to function. A proper functioning diaphragm also stimulates lower gastrointestinal mobility. It suppresses gastric reflux forces. And lastly, it enhances venous return, or getting blood back to the heart. So hopefully right about now, we all get that a proper functioning diaphragm has great benefits that reach beyond just breathing or moving air in and out. Next, let's take a look at what regulates our breathing, because here the story gets really interesting. At the risk of oversimplifying something that's very complex, I'd like to point out that our breathing is regulated by different parts of our brain or different parts of our being. We can change our breathing by thinking about it or using the frontal cortex. We can change our breathing by what we feel. We usually associate it with the middle part of our brain or the amygdala cortex. And then lastly, the hind part of our brain, or as we unaffectionately call our primitive brain, is actually the king regulator of breathing. Or I should say, when our breathing is really done well, it isn't influenced so much by our thinking or by our feeling, and it really is running on the wisdom of the normal regulatory centers that live in the hind part of our brain and other parts of our body. For now, let's appreciate something pretty profound, and that's that our breathing is a reflection of how we think, how we feel, how we act, and essentially how we are. We also can appreciate that the way you breathe can actually affect the way you think, feel, and act. To the degree to which this can affect it is, I think, largely unknown and varies from person to person. But it is important to recognize that the phenomena does exist, that we can use our breathing as a way to change the way we think, feel, and behave, just as it works the other way. To begin to leverage this phenomena, it'll help to understand some basic concepts. The most common, by far, breathing dysfunction in people with normal heart and lung function is that they're actually overbreathing. And so while it may be true that a body may not feel like it's getting enough oxygen, for most, the real reason is that the person is overbreathing or hyperventilating. Here's roughly how the story goes. The person overbreathes because they're feeling stressed out about something. This reaction to stress or overbreathing brings in more oxygen, but it decreases CO2. Think of it as a teeter-totter. If one goes up, the other goes down. The decrease in CO2 increases the pH of our blood or makes our blood more basic. And because our blood has a very narrow window of good pH, this becomes a problem pretty fast. This problem causes adaptive changes, like suppressing the function of some organs and overactivating others. And while this may not kill us directly because our bodies are brilliant at compensating, it does mean that we'll have to work harder just to maintain baseline function. These adaptive changes can lead to systemic symptoms like dizziness, tingling in the hands and feet, decreased memory, increased pain, and a general sense of unease, among many other symptoms. pH is a key to respiration. pH determines hemoglobin's willingness to let go of oxygen or not. We understand this by way of the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation, which helps us understand how the blood pH is determined. The Henderson-Hasselbalch equation can be simplified to read: pH is determined largely by bicarbonates, produced from our kidneys, and by CO2, which is regulated primarily by our breathing behavior. Or more simply put, pH is determined by kidney function divided by breathing behavior. And for all of us, even somewhat versed in math, we understand that small changes in the denominator actually equal significant changes in the result, or changes in our breathing behavior have a significant impact on the pH of our blood. So breathing behavior has a potentially large effect and fast effect on the pH of our blood. If you doubt this, pause the video and take 5 deep and fast breaths. And in this amount of time, most of us will feel those systemic symptoms that I mentioned earlier. If you just tried that activity, let's take a look at what brain imaging shows may have just happened. With normal, healthy breathing, our end-tidal CO2, or the CO2 at the end of our breath out, is right around 35 to 40 millimeters mercury of pressure. With light hyperventilation, like the 5 breaths you may have just taken, we see a dramatic reduction in the oxygenation of the brain. And appreciate that most systems in our body temporarily experience the same change in oxygen status. Let's summarize. Overbreathing increases oxygen and decreases CO2. That decrease in CO2 increases blood pH. That change in blood pH causes systemic adaptive changes that then lead to systemic symptoms. Let's circle back one more time to the very common cause. In most cases, it's all about the perception of a threat without a resulting physical demand. It's like our mind and our body perceives a threat, physical or mental, and our physical body starts to prepare for a physical event that never really comes. Now our breathing brilliantly increases to get ready for the physical demand, and if that physical demand is limited to a mental threat without an increase in physical action, we'll find ourselves overbreathing. And if this happens often enough, it becomes a pattern and our whole system suffers. The cool part is we can use capnography to see if this is happening or not. A CapnoTrainer, the device pictured, can be used to watch and assess CO2 levels in a way that provides valuable feedback to help us undo this pattern if it exists. This is a capnograph tracking CO2. With normal heart and lung function, end-tidal CO2, or the CO2 at the end of a breath out, is the same as arterial CO2. Remember, CO2 drives pH. This graph shows normal breathing at a breath rate of about 8 breaths per minute and an end-tidal CO2 greater than 36, which is good. This next graph shows a chronic pattern of overbreathing. Here you can see that the breath rate is around 17 breaths per minute, while the end-tidal CO2 is much lower at 26. Remember, low CO2 is a sign of overbreathing or hyperventilation. There's no doubt this is the person in which we'd like to get to slow the breath and actually move less volume of air. I'd like to pull in one more aspect of science and technology, and this is what we know about heart rate variability. Heart rate variability is the difference in heart rate between the breath in and the breath out. That difference is positively correlated with health. In other words, the larger the difference, or the more variability between the breath in and the breath out, the potentially healthier a system is. We all have a resonant breathing frequency, or a rate at which we breathe that optimizes heart rate variability. You can think of this as our best breath rate, or the rate at which breathing falls into sync with our heart rate. It's important to note that breathing faster or slower may actually decrease our heart rate variability. Now, the unfortunate part about the story is that simply telling someone to breathe at their predetermined resonant breathing frequency does not necessarily assure good heart rate variability, which is unfortunate because the simplicity would sure be helpful. As it turns out, the better way to reach a resonant breathing frequency is to let the body find it on its own. This generally happens as we increase the tone of the parasympathetic nervous system or realize feelings of contentment and peace. As we allow the breath to be natural, removing perceived threats over time, the breath has potential to settle into its best breath rate. We use capnography as a way to help the individual learn what good chemistry feels like. We use the science of heart rate variability to also help inform the concept that we don't necessarily want somebody continually working to breathe slower. We really want them finding their best rate. All of this to say, we're using this bit of science and technology as a way to help the person find their best breath so that at any point in time, they can pull that good breathing into whatever situation they find themselves. The takeaway I'd like you to appreciate is that while breathing slower is generally better, breathing too slow or less than our resonant breathing frequency can actually be problematic. Up until now, we've talked about the significance of CO2, breath chemistry, and breath rate. Now we're ready to start to open the door to breath correction. And the purpose of this presentation, or this part, is simply to start the concepts. The real work, the learning, and the understanding for yourself will come during the lab sessions. The mechanics of a good breath at rest are relatively simple. There's roughly 50-50 movement between the abdomen and the chest. The breath starts low and includes a 360-degree expansion. In other words, the low back expands, as does the abdominal area. In correct diaphragmatic breathing, this is actually very subtle motion. This video does a nice job of demonstrating the lateral movement of the ribs that happens with the breath in. Now that you understand the mechanics of the breath, I have to mention a small little catch, and that's that breathing pattern dysfunction of overbreathing is frequently made worse by improving breath mechanics, because the rate, the volume, and the autonomic nervous system are not addressed. So meaningful correction comes from realizing good mechanics, right-sizing the breath, rate, and volume, and having a keen awareness of thoughts and feelings. For now, suffice it to say that the key aspects of improving breath generally lie in improving the mechanics by feeling the posterolateral rib expansion, slowing the breath, making it more subtle, and building awareness around thoughts and feelings. The biofeedback of capnography can be helpful to start connecting the breath behavior, thoughts, and actions with chemistry. That said, I'd like to point out that there's a valuable tool that can help detect the presence of overbreathing that doesn't rely or depend on the technology of capnography. There's a useful open source tool called the Nijmegen Questionnaire. Scores above 19 indicate the potential presence of hyperventilation. And while those scoring less than 19 may still benefit from this work, those scoring over 19 certainly have something to gain. This tool can be useful to measure progress, just as it can be useful for any practitioner who does not have access to a Capno trainer but wants to know if breath work would be beneficial. As we close this presentation, I'd like to pose a question to help give this work perspective. We'd be wise to ask ourselves, are we correcting the breath, or is the breath correcting us? In other words, should we always be controlling or changing the breath, or letting the breath change us? I suspect the power of profound breath work includes both, but eventually progresses to the latter. In other words, eventually it's all about allowing the breath to guide or correct us. As a final summary before the lab work, I'd like to point out that overbreathing is the most common breathing problem. Slower breathing is generally better, but too slow can be problematic. The correct breath includes a subtle expansion of the lower back and lateral ribs. The Nijmegen Questionnaire may be helpful in identifying overbreathing, and breathing is a reflection of how we think, how we feel, and how we act, and in that, awareness is key. So again, my name is David Depler. I appreciate you taking the time to learn this information, and mostly I look forward to working with you in the lab portion to better understand what all this means for you.